Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. When I was an undergraduate design student, a little over 15 years ago now, I stumbled upon a book called Wabi-Sabi for Artists, Designers, Poets, and Philosophers. It was a small book. It was a quiet book. If I remember correctly, I read it in one sitting, and it was my first introduction to the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, this idea of finding beauty in imperfection. I was taken with the ideas in the book immediately, but I was also taken with the package. The book felt like it was embodying the ideas as it mixed this sort of light gray typography with these beautiful black and white images. It was a really thoughtfully designed book, very clearly. A few years later, as I was getting into postmodern graphic design, I found a curious magazine called Wet, a magazine for gourmet bathing that was published in the 70s and 80s. I was confused by this magazine. I had no idea what gourmet bathing was or why April Greiman, one of the giants of postmodern graphic design, had designed one of its covers. But I filed it away as a great piece of graphic design, and I still actually show that April Greiman cover to my students today. What surprises me, even today, all these years later, is that both of these projects, Wabi-Sabi and Wet, are from the same person, Leonard Koren. Leonard is a hard person to describe. Most biographies of him describe him as an aesthetics expert, but that feels too clean to me. It feels too tidy for me. Leonard is an artist who went on to study architecture and then made a magazine about bathing before building a career making these simple, quiet books like Wabi-Sabi, or his latest, which just came out earlier this year, Making Things Aesthetic, which is this practical meditation on artistic strategies and methodologies. He's also written books on Japanese fashion, aesthetics, the design of baths, object placement, and a fun memoir called Musings of a Curious Aesthete. On the occasion of his latest book, Making Things Aesthetic, I invited Leonard on the show to talk about the ideas in his books, as well as his fascinating career shifts. As you can guess, this conversation goes into some interesting ideas. We begin talking about the new book and the role of methodologies in the creative process. We talk about bookmaking and the role of design in his writing process. And we also talk about Wet Magazine and his introduction to graphic design and being a part of the avant-garde design movement, as well as the state of design today. Scratching the Surface is supported by listeners like you. If you like what we do here, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus content each month, like exclusive newsletters, bonus interviews, and full transcripts of every episode. All of this helps keep the show free for everyone all the time, so your support is greatly appreciated. You can head over to patreon.com/surfacepodcast to sign up and help support the show. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Leonard Koren. I thought we'd begin by talking a little bit about your new book that just came out. It's called On Creating Things Aesthetic. And you describe this book as a book about methodology. Can you describe what methodologies are or what methodology means in the context of this new book of yours?
To me, it means the processes, the procedures, the methods, and the strategies that we use when we try to solve problems. And it occurred to me that it's something that's always interested me when I see work, artistic work or design work, and I see something particularly intriguing. I would think about what is the thought process that went behind making this. The manifestation of the thing itself was never as interesting to me as the idea or the conception of how it came to the conception came to be. So that's really what I wanted to make a book about. But in the end, I think it turned out to be a book. Let's say we could call it in the mass market. Mass marketplace. It's a creativity book. It's a book about creative process. And what I very much didn't want it to be is a book with a lot of woo-woo, like a book by a famous music producer now on creativity that was written by a ghostwriter. Or a book by somebody who wants to make it in the art world and talks about what's the best way to steal other people's ideas. I was really more of a self-reflective book about what I've used and what I've seen and how to communicate it in the most succinct, charming way possible. And it's even short for one of my books, which are generally pretty short.
Yeah.
But also I think it's quite resonant because for the visuals, first of all, I'm going to back up for a second. I threw this book out 6 or 7 times because I knew what I wanted to write about, but I didn't know how to approach it. And all my approaches were pretty pretentious, basically over thought.
Yeah.
And I had an experience here in Rome. I was asked to do a show about a magazine I used to produce called Wet Magazine. And I always say no when I'm asked to do this, but for various reasons, I said yes this time. And I designed the show without thinking, very quickly. And the opening night of the show, I realized, gee, this turned out pretty good. And I wonder why. And then I realized that it's because I operated almost entirely on instinct, on intuition to put the show together. So I thought, well, maybe I should apply that same methodology to this book. And so the book that came out on creating things aesthetic is kind of it's just sort of a burst of accumulated ideas and all the research I had done in the previous versions that I threw away. So one thing that I should mention, or maybe you would, or somebody, it becomes immediately obvious to somebody who actually has the book, is that all the photographs are about things that occur in contemporary Rome, which is where I live now. And I just happened to be taking pictures with my phone, and I realized that these images sort of would fulfill the graphic or the visual needs for this book, and I use them. And there's also another subtext, or in the afterword of the book, I talk about how I'm a little bit cynical about the idea of this use of the word brilliance and genius that we use so often.
Right.
And I think that what creators do today is wonderful, and there's some marvelously talented people out there who do things that are quite evocative and thought-provoking. But to me, when I started, the more I thought about the methodologies we use when we create something, the more I realized that it's pretty basic mental operations, and we're not as smart as we think we are. So that is a kind of a subtext to the book.
What was surprised? I have sort of 2 questions about that, and I was really surprised / struck by the simplicity of the book, by the practicality of it, that there was no, to use your language, there's no woo. It was just like, here's how you do it. Here's how you sort of work through methodologies. And I'm wondering how your own methodologies have changed over your career. I mean, you've been making books like this for 40 years at this point. Have you noticed changes in that approach? And the reason I ask that is this idea that you wrote this book multiple times and couldn't get it right. How have you sort of worked through those issues in different ways?
The first book that one does, the first book that I did, is relatively easy. You make a book with all the ideas you have and you make it. But if you're a person like me, you don't want to make the same thing twice.
Mm-hmm.
You constantly up the bar, and so each book becomes, in a sense, more difficult. Unlike what would seem obvious, that things should become simpler once you learn how to do them. And of course, you can do that. You can make the same kind of book over and over again and make it better and better. But that's not the path I chose. I chose to, and this is probably a character, an innate character feature of who I am, to challenge myself each time and to satisfy my curiosity about things.
Mm-hmm.
So getting back to your question about methodologies I use, have they changed? I think they have, but I never thought about the way they have. I start each book with a struggle, because the first half of making every book involves not knowing what the book is about.
Right.
So I have maybe a dozen or so ideas that I'm thinking about, sort of a constellation of concepts that intrigue me. And I would somehow like to make them all come together like a puzzle into some coherent structure. So I guess I have to trick myself in order to make that happen. It's I try everything, and if looked from the outside, you would think, well, this guy is pretty unsystematic. And in a sense, it's purposeful, because to follow the straight line, to be too efficient would not create the kind of book that I want. So I struggle. And I would say that struggling is my number one methodology. But the other thing is, the other methodology that I learned that actually from the get-go is that time is a very important ingredient in what I do. So that's why I never felt comfortable working with clients, because clients always want, there's a time-money equation.
Right.
If it takes 2 years, it takes 2 years. I surrender to the process. So that's another, I guess, methodological consideration. And the third one that has been consistent throughout is I ask lots of questions. Mm-hmm. And I learned that early on with my first real book, a book about Japanese fashion. I had the privilege to work on every aspect of that book, including creating the cover. So I was in Japan at the time, and I had this rather elaborate photo shoot. It was after publishing Wet Magazine for a number of years, so I thought I knew how to do this. And I created this cover, and something bothered me about the cover, but everybody I showed it to at the Japanese publishing company liked it, and they complimented me. But something really bothered me. So I had lunch with a friend of mine who is the editor of the most popular fashion magazine in Japan. And I said, I'd like to show you the cover. And she saw the cover and she laughed and she said, "That's horrible." And and in a way, it was shocking, but it was so good because it
Mhm.
made me feel, she's right. It is horrible. Everybody else is just saying whatever, for whatever reasons they said they liked it. So I begged the publisher to let me redo the cover. And they said, no, 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 no. And it was a very emotional moment for me. But finally, I was able to make a new cover, and it was satisfactory.
I think that speaks. I have one more question about methodologies and about the new book before we talk about your larger career. But I think that that story speaks to the designing the show for Wet Magazine also, where there was this sort of intuition that was guiding you, this sense of like, you're sort of following, you're surrendering to the process, to sort of use your language. You also mentioned that this new book is the first book that you wrote after you moved to Italy. You were living in Northern California for uh, the last number of years. You and your family moved to Italy, and I'm wondering how that change has influenced methodologies here. If methodologies determine what we create, how do the context for those methodologies also influence what we create? Was there something different in making this book in a new location?
I would think that the my interest in methodologies and my sense of methodologies is a little bit more hardwired in my
Mm.
brain. But the context had changed, the cultural context had changed. And I've coming from the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a lot about tech. It's very competitive, and it's a very narrow vision of what the future can or should be. And I was liberated from that context. And the first year we lived here, we were in a small hilltop town, old Etruscan town. And um, I was a little bit adrift. I wanted to make a book, but I didn't know even it was going to be about methodology until the end of that year.
Mm.
Um, uh, I was kind of searching for things to make a book about. I was where my curiosity and what I think might be a need in the world intersected. So in this on creating things aesthetic book, I described that epiphanal moment where I was sitting on a beach at the Tuscan Lazio border and was engaged in a free association exercise, trying to figure out, well, what is it that I'm really interested in now
Mm.
that I'm in this, strange new land? And methodology came out because it's an interest that is woven in and out of my life since the wet days, really.
How did being in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, how did that influence your work? I agree with you that that is a very tech centered universe with a narrow vision of the future, and your books in many many ways feel like they're going in the opposite direction that Silicon Valley is telling us the future is headed. Was that a conscious response to the physical environment that you were in?
Well, the ironic thing about the Bay Area is, that all the techies, Jack Dorsey, who is one of the founders of Twitter, and one of the founders of Pinterest, both used my books to, uh, I don't know, they somehow my books spoke to both of these people.
Huh.
Uh, I didn't understand how or why exactly, but in the end, I felt irrelevant. I felt that um, when you make a book, it's a communicational act. It means that
Mhm.
you want to connect with other people, other minds. So I didn't really relate so well to the minds I was meeting in the Bay Area.
Mhm.
There were some lovely people. There were many things I admired about openness to certain kinds of things, a degree of civility that was really nice in the people. People tended not to burn bridges.
Mm.
Um, but in the end, I felt irrelevant and I felt bored. So it was time to leave.
Let's talk about sort of your larger work and maybe the sort of the project that sort of guides a lot of your work. You call your books conceptual tools, or that the thing that you are making are conceptual tools. What does it mean to make a conceptual tool? What's a conceptual tool?
Well, in a way, I was being a little ironic and a little pretentious intentionally. Um, it means that some of my books, let's say like the Wabi-Sabi book, they provide a kind of uh, sustenance or an infrastructure for thought or a vocabulary for things that I think sensitive creators already know about, but they may not know how to intellectually structure it or talk about it. So that's what I mean by a conceptual tool. It's sort of it's not a hammer, it's not a screwdriver, but it's another kind of device that you could use in your work if you're a creator to further your thought.
How did you arrive at that? I'm not even sure the word, that format, that media. How did you sort of figure out that the thing that you were making were structures for how people are already thinking? You know what I mean? I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of that process a little bit.
So that's it's a retrospective realization. So the first book I made was about Japanese fashion. And then I made a few other books with whatever was around me. And it was really a lot of fun. The formats were interesting. I think I was still in a wet magazine like mentality a bit, my approach. And then there was a rupture with the world of commercial publishing because I found that salesmen were making more and more of the decisions in the companies, and I really needed curious editors to work with. So I decided to publish my own books, but on a limited budget. And my first two books, one was called How to Take a Japanese Bath, the other How to Rake Leaves, and they were both successful, but they were primarily like they were very text light and with very potent illustrations, not too many, but they both dealt with the subjects in a poetic way, and they were both successful in their modest way. But I felt they left me feeling at the end of those two books, that I needed to go deeper. So I thought, well, what do I want to do that's deeper? And so I was living in Japan most of the time then, and I tried to figure out what was the core of the Japanese aesthetic sensibility that attracted me. What was it? There's a lot of wonderful Japanese words to describe different, very niche aesthetic concepts. And when I ultimately made Wabi-Sabi book, and I came around to understand that this was what it was, and co-joined the terms. And basically, it doesn't seem like a very big deal here, but to make a book about Wabi-Sabi in Japan at the time, there was no such thing of wabi-sabi in any of the dictionaries. There was
Mm.
wabi and the sabi. And it was a kind of, in a sense, throwing down the gauntlet. It was something. It was sort of like throwing a rock at the theoretical establishment there, and I was surprised actually at how good the book turned out. Since I've never done a book like that.
Right.
One of my good friends at the time, an older uh, intellectual friend, said, "I didn't know you could do that kind of work." And that was a self-reflective moment, because it's true. I didn't know I could even think,
Mm.
because Wet was all about was it. Of course, there was thought in making Wet magazine, but it was a different kind of thought. It was not analytical. It was not asking question to
Mm.
analyze the mechanics of an aesthetic sensibility. So after making Wabi-Sabi, I made a few other books, and probably after the fourth or fifth book of this nature that explored a particular corridor of aesthetic realm, I realized that and the feedback I was getting, combined with the feedback I was getting from artist and designer friends, I realized that I was providing some kind of nourishment, some kind of
Mm.
intellectual nourishment, but packaged in a way that was pleasant and appealing, and not too taxing and not academic. And so I just thought, that conceptual tool was a, as good any way of describing it for what it was I was making.
This is perhaps a weird question or a strange sort of follow-up question. You worked as an artist. You published a magazine, which we'll talk about in a second. You studied you went to graduate school for architecture, and you've since sort of made this career as a writer, writing conceptual tools, and you're writing in the format of these books. And these books are all in similar format, a mix of text and image, very sort of austerely designed. How does the form of the book influence what you're writing, or influence the delivery of these ideas? I guess the question that I'm asking is, you spent a lot of time experimenting with a lot of different forms, and the book has become this sort of constant for the last 40 years. What is it about that form that has continued to excite you, I guess, or continued to keep you interesting?
Well, the book form itself appeals to my notions of economy, portability. There's a totemic quality to books. In other words, a book could be its mere existence. Its mere existence on somebody's night table could be empowering. I think that I first got the notion to make books, or that the idea of book-like form was interesting, is I had a friend around the time I was publishing Wet, whose father was a famous movie lyricist,
Mm.
songwriter, songwriting, part of his songwriting various teams, enormously wealthy. And I imagined that whenever I'd see him in the house, the father would be padding around in his bathrobe and slippers and lighting a cigarette and smoking them. And so I imagined that the way he works is, when he has an idea, he writes it on the back of a matchbook. And that's how he writes his lyrics. And um, I don't think that was the way he actually did it, but the idea of the economy, uh, the ecological, the cost, the economic aspect, the ecological aspect of it, um, the non-intrusive aspect of books, that's really what appealed to me. And also, it's a funny thing, when I was in college, the class that I think was most influential to me in the end was a printmaking class I took.
Mm.
And the idea of the print, you make, let's say, an etching or a lithograph, you make one print and then another and another. But when you assemble those 30 prints afterwards and you really look at them carefully with a critical eye, you realize that each one is actually a little bit different. And so I was able to say, well, this one is the best one.
Mm-hmm.
On Tuesday, this is the
Mm-hmm.
best one. Maybe on Wednesday it wasn't. And so the idea of reproducibility, spending a lot of time making one thing and then reproducing it a lot. It could have been, if I was a musician, it would have been making a perfect record, maybe.
Right.
That's how I gravitated towards the book form. Also, the fact that books are, you could combine words, images, and tactility is it's very three powerful mediums or three sensorial modalities combined. I would prefer, in a way, if I was a singer-songwriter, because there's nothing that compares to me to music, to get the emotionality, and then you also have the ideational levels too. But since I'm not gifted that way, and it stopped my music practice early in life, this is kind of what I'm stuck with.
You've been making these books, you've been writing them, but you're also designing and producing them and self-publishing them. And so you're thinking, even when talking about the new book, you're including these phone camera images in it. How does that interplay between text and image, or the act of turning the page and what text sits next to an image and how much text there is on a page? How does that influence the writing itself? Are you writing these books thinking about that layout? Is that something that's happening in the editing process? I'm curious. I guess what I'm asking is the sort of the design of these books, how that's influencing or affecting the ideas themselves.
Well, I would say that with the Wabi-Sabi book was very interesting in that I designed the book. I thought of the object quality, the paper. I took the pictures and I wrote it all at the same time.
Mm.
So it all came together at the same time. And because there are decisions, like in that particular book, the type is all 60% black.
Mm-hmm.
And as opposed to, having a second color. One of the I guess, methodologies or methodological considerations that I've carried forward from my making wet days was that try to make things as inexpensively as possible.
Yeah.
That quality is not, that just having expensive object quality, conventional things, qualities is really not going to further my ideas. And that ironic interplay of making something that's very precious, but very non-precious in the standard material hierarchies we have is really an equation I like to maintain. So all my books are pretty inexpensive and accessible, and hopefully easy to print. So getting back to your question about the design, how it influences, I had an experience actually today, believe it or not. One of my books called Arranging Things, A Rhetoric of Object Placement, has been republished by a Spanish publisher. in a larger format. They asked if they can, well, they wanted to redesign it. And so, in the spirit of fun, and I let them redesign it. And to me, what they did was they separated the text from the pictures. The original book is a very the text and the pictures weave through each other. In my writing is, I never thought of myself as a writer. I thought of myself as a person who liked me create things, and I have certain tools at my disposal, words, because that's my birthright as a native English speaker. But I was never a very good writer. And so with each book, I think my writing is improved. I think probably my best writing is in the current book or the last two books. This particular book, Arranging Things, the writing, I think, is a little turgid. But I think that the concepts are very strong and very powerful. So when I saw the book, in a sense, deconstructed, disassembled, and reassembled as a text part and a visual part, it emphasizes how bad the writing is. Whereas unconsciously, when I designed the first book, I designed it to, in a sense, disguise the writing, and so you don't really notice. The ideas are so strong that they stand out. But when you isolate the writing, then the game is over. So I have a book that, in fact, after our interview here, the publisher of this book is interested in my opinion of what I think of the book, and I have to be a little diplomatic. I don't want to hurt their feelings, and since it's already been done,
Right.
it's okay. It's just a learning experience for me.
Yeah.
So the overall answer to the question is that since the design is often a consideration while writing the book, it's actually evolving. The two are very well. It's a very symbiotic connection, hopefully.
I want to connect this. You already mentioned sort of the things you learned from working on Wet that have influenced how you designed the book, and I would like to connect this a little more specifically to Wet magazine, which, to prepare for this conversation, I read tons of interviews and profiles of you, and everybody wants to talk about Wet all the time. And so I've been holding off as long as I can, but I'm hoping we can sort of talk about it from a little bit of a different angle. So Wet was a magazine you produced from 1976 to 1981.
Through 81, yes.
And you produced 34 issues. It was called a Magazine of Gourmet Bathing, which was this term that you sort of came up with, and not totally sure what it meant.
Yeah, it was Wet, the Magazine of Gourmet Bathing. Yes.
And I would like to talk about the visual design of the magazine. You designed a lot of the early issues yourself. You had other designers working with you later on, from what I understand. There's a sort of April Greiman cover that I still show my students today in talking about sort of postmodern graphic design. But that was a very loud, extravagant, that was part of the sort of postmodern new wave graphic design movement at that time, which is very, very different than the design of your books. And I'm wondering if you see a connection between the visual design of Wet and the design of your books, and that sort of oppositeness in their aesthetic.
I'd say that the continuity or the similarity is that I think from an early age, I had a strong sense of visual rightness. It's a funny way to phrase it. I kind of had a sense of what I thought was appealing. and that hasn't changed.
Mm.
For wet, even I designed for the first year or so, I designed all the issues and all the covers, and then subsequently, when I stepped back from the day-to-day design, I was still very involved. I had to make sure that the covers were what I wanted, and that the
Mm.
interior, the magazine, sort of met certain criteria that I had for what was going to be powerful and sensorially um, effective. But a magazine is a magazine. And I learned that with the story I was telling you before about the cover of my first book, the
Yeah.
Japanese fashion book. What I had designed was a magazine cover for a book. And that's what disturbed me, but I didn't understand that was the problem. Uh, Book covers and magazine covers are different animals.
Mm.
And a book is a much more sedate, contemplative entity, whereas a magazine is like, here, grab us. We're only going to be around for a short period of time. We're ephemeral. This is very important. Read it really now. And when you do that to a book cover, it's uh, it's a little bit it's a little bit too much in your
Right.
face
Yeah.
for. So the reason that my books are much more, let's say, subtle or sedate looking, or have a different, they have a buzz, I think, a little bit to them, but
Mm.
it's a much lower key buzz. It's not the teenager anymore. It's the older, the older person.
Yeah.
And but it's still the same inner processing of visual material that results in some kind of manifest output.
I mentioned that the visual design of wet was played a big role in that sort of early move into what we now call postmodern graphic design, new wave graphic design. There was this sort of extravagance, this sort of layering of text and image, sort of collage sort of mentality. And I see you as somebody who's sort of moving between a lot of different worlds. You're sort of in a bunch of different groups. Were you aware that the design of wet at the time was doing something new, or was part of this sort of larger um larger sort of aesthetic turn in graphic design? How conscious were you of the graphic design world at that time, and how what you were doing was part of some bigger movement?
So this might sound a little funny, but I met my first graphic designer when I was 30 years old. I never even thought about graphic design until I was 30, after architecture school, after everything. The art milieu that I hung out as part of considered graphic design to be graphic decoration.
Mm.
It was a demeaning term. It
Yeah.
was something you wanted to avoid. In fact, I like to have all my books look undesigned, not done by a graphic designer. And I've had friends say, did you really mean to design it like this? Because when things fall too clearly and comfortably into quote unquote the good design category, um, we can kind of check them off the list and ignore them. So sometimes I like to do things that have a little bit of, they're a little discordant or a
Mm.
little cacophonous, that because then it makes you stop for a moment and say, well, what's going on here?
Hmm.
And I think that the cover of my current book, the front and back cover of the on creating things aesthetic, has a little bit of that quality. It's sort of like it's something appealing about it, but there's something like, wait a second, what's going on here? But not in the normal provocative way. It's just kind of quietly saying that. So that tone, the pitch,
Mm-hmm.
has become much more, I'd say, refined over the years when I've done things. So okay, so going back to WED, I was absolutely unaware of any movements in graphic design at the time when I started WED. Totally unaware. I came from a art and architecture background, um, and I was just trying to combine words and pictures in a way that um, elicited the kind of thoughts and feelings I wanted to. And it wasn't till like issue 6 or 7 that I met a graphic designer named Tom Ingalls,
Mm.
and I learned about all these graphic design tools, and I realized that this would enable me to more efficiently say what I wanted to say. And then I began to, because of Tom gave me entry into this world of graphic designers, and many of them came through WET,
Right.
and worked on it. April was one of them,
Yeah.
and and I was open to expanding the visual language. So it when you're on the crest of a wave, of a cultural wave, you're not really aware of what you're doing is new or whatever. You know, it's only at a certain point you realize, oh, okay, and then you get off the wave, and then it's history. So there was not a self consciousness about doing anything new or interesting.
I like that you use the word undesigned in there too, that you like things that are undesigned. And I wanted to briefly mention, I'm not sure if there's a question here, but if you have a thought to what I'm about to say, I'm curious. One of my favorite books of yours is actually Undesigning the Bath, which came out in 1998. And you have this line in that book where you say an underlying goal of ergonomics, user friendliness, product semantics, and of quote responsible industrial design generally is to recast our entire material world into something more useful and predictable. And I love that line because it feels like it speaks to this current moment and sort of the design, to go back to our Silicon Valley conversation, a design that is all about optimization, all about making things useful, predictable, organized. And in many ways, that's sort of how design is thought about and taught today, for better and for worse. And I'm wondering if you sort of have thoughts on that more generally outside of the context of baths, this idea of design being solely a way to optimize, to predict, to be useful. And so much of what you're talking about and so much of your work is, in my view, is really thinking about design much broader, thinking about it as culture, as aesthetic, as feeling. I guess not to be woo woo. I know we're trying to avoid that, but do you know what I mean?
I'm a non-institutional kind of person.
Yeah.
I think that early in life, when I first started college, I realized that I wanted to I wanted to have an interesting life, and to have clients, or to do things the way they've always been done, or have a regular profession. This didn't interest me. So when I see things, like as I said before, that it's too good taste, there's a part of me that it really, or too refined, that it really appeals to. I'm a sucker for that, like anybody else. But there's also a part that is a little, that I have a revulsion against or towards, because there's a kind of manipulation going on. There's
Mm-hmm.
the Uber language of our culture is hypnotizing me into thinking and feeling in a certain way, and I want to get beyond that. So it was the realization I had with baths in particular, or that was the starting point, that I'd been to a lot of really amazingly designed baths. And the feeling I always walked away with was, well, that really looked nice and that seemed really fantastic, but it wasn't as good as my, funky old bathtub. The actual experience, the viscerally,
Yeah.
it was not as satisfying. And then I began to see that probably applied to other things too. That some of the most interesting architecture I've been in doesn't look good in photographs.
Mm.
Why is that so? So much of what we have we've migrated towards certain senses, or we've gravitated towards certain senses to the exclusion of others. And there's this sense of sort of a more encompassing sense of things that we don't recognize anymore, at least officially recognize anymore, that I want to get to.
Mm.
And I think that to say undesign is sort of a code for that, to say that we don't want to be, let's think in non-conventional ways to get to new feelings.
I want to connect that briefly about your architecture education, because in your book, Musings of a Curious Aesthete, you talk about going back to school and studying architecture, and you describe that decision. You say, on a symbolic level, architecture is, of course, all about creating structure. And you talk about this sort of desire for structure in your life. And I read that, and I was thinking about this idea of conceptual tools. I had just read the new book, thinking about methodologies, that still what you are doing is creating structures, that these conceptual tools, these methodologies, are also a type of structure making. Do you see your work as architectural in any way? Is there something from that education, even though you sort of knew early that you were not going to be an architect in the traditional sense, that you think has influenced this career that you've had?
Yeah, I think that I mean, we can't see ourselves as clearly sometimes as other people can, but to structure thought or structure concepts in a very clear way, it's very much, I could say, an architectural process. It's like trying to make a crisp, clean, modernist building where everything is, the circulation is very logical. There are moments of delight, but you're not going to get lost, and certain things will clarify for you. So yes, I think in that sense, that's the architectural mind at work.
As I was reading and rereading a lot of your books to prepare for this, I kept thinking of that Godard quote: "Every film is a documentary of its own making." And so much of your work feels like a revealing of the making of the work. And this goes back to
Mhm.
that early conversation about methodologies. And I'm wondering sort of how, like, what you're thinking about now. What are the questions that are driving your work now that are, you think will be revealing themselves in the next books, or in the next projects?
Uh, I'm having a little bit of trouble with this book, and I'm not anxious about it. I'm very relaxed about it because I'm thinking about what it means to be a human being, and there are a lot of proposals out there put out by tech people and governments and warring factions about what it means to be a person, or what constitutes human life, and what human life will be like in the future. So, with all of my aptitudes and who I amness, I'm that's what I'm thinking about. What it means to be a human being.
What are you reading right now?
I'm reading a novel called Bel Canto by Ann Patchett, and she's a really good writer. It's it's kind of a delightful book to read before you go to bed. Before that, just before that, I read for the fifth or sixth time Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind.
Oh yeah,
by Suzuki Roshi. And interestingly, every time I read that book, I read it every 7 or 8 years. Every time I don't remember reading it before because it's like a completely different book. In fact, this book, I think when I first read it, I totally understood it. Now I don't understand it at all. I mean, I understand one part of it, to, sit and meditate twice a day and don't think about getting any benefit from that. But don't worry, it'll help.
I love that. Leonard, this was a complete honor. I found your work so fascinating and energizing for me and my work, and so it was so nice to talk to you. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it was a pleasure talking with you too.
And that was my conversation with Leonard Koren. His latest book is called Making Things Aesthetic, and it is available wherever you get your books. This episode was recorded on April 3rd, 2024. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is and always will be free thanks to the generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you like what we're doing here, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.